The title of the course itself is A Political History of the Cold War in the Third World. And the question obviously comes up, how do we look at history? All historians, they spend the first couple of modules, in fact, just on explaining what history is. Jasper Griffin from Oxford says we look into history from motives of two kinds. There is curiosity about the past, naturally, what happened, who did what and why, and there is the hope to, more importantly, understand the present. How to place and interpret our own times, our own selves, our own experiences, and our hopes for the future. आपने वो फिक्रा तो सुना होगा, those who do not know their history are condemned to repeat it. या वो भी क्लीशे आपने सुना होगा दूसरा वाला कि history is always repeated twice, first as a tragedy and the second time as a farce, which is the saying of Hegel, of course. So our attempt here is to examine this history, but not just for the purpose of curiosity, but really to understand how we arrived at the present and where we are heading in the future. First, let's just introduce the terms very briefly, although they are quite self-explanatory. The Cold War and the Third World. The Cold War is a term that was first used in the 1950s. It's not been used before that. So 19th century, early 20th century literature aap utha ke dekhenge, you won't find this word, this term being used. And really, it's a concept developed by the United States of America or intellectuals in the US to describe how they would contain the Soviet Union and communism. They couldn't afford a hot war because the Soviet Union was a very powerful military state with nuclear weapons. So instead, they would try and contain it slowly and squeeze it in that way. And that meant, of course, that the theater of war was not going to be the Soviet Union, but in fact the rest of the world, especially the Third World. And that's why it's referred to not as a hot war, but as a Cold War. The period of the Cold War is right after the Second World War, from 1945 till the breakup of the USSR, or the defeat of socialism in the USSR, which is 1991. On the other hand, the word Third World often causes confusion. कुछ लोग ये समझते हैं कि Third World का मतलब ये है कि जिस तरह third class ticket होता है तो ये भी वो third class किस्म के लोग हैं. That's not at all what this means. In fact, the term was first coined by a French scholar. And in France, the term third estate has a very radical connotation, because it was the third estate which overthrew the first and second estate and caused the French Revolution. The first estate was, of course, the clergy, the second estate was the nobility, and the third estate was the common people. That is how the General Assembly in France was organized. So when the third estate took power, that is what we refer to basically as the French Revolution. So the author who coined the term Third World for all of us in most of Asia, Africa, and Latin America really meant by it that this is now the revolutionary world. This is the world from where the entire global system is going to achieve a great transformation. And it is for this reason, I think, that leaders of the Third World, especially those who came together in the Bandung Conference in Indonesia in 1959, liked this term because it implied how a revolution from the Third World was going to change the entire global order. So the Third World, therefore, refers to pretty much all of Africa, most of Asia, and pretty much all of South America, as well as Latin America, Central America, and so on. Now, we may think that it is the way in which the Third World was shaped was of our own doing, and to some extent that is also correct. there are certain conflicts that cannot be explained by the Cold War. The India-Pakistan rivalry, for example, cannot really be explained via the Cold War. The Cold War interferes with it, but really its origins are not in the Cold War. Its origins are in the very creation of Pakistan and the politics that comes out of the contestation between the Muslim League on the one hand and Congress on the other hand. But many of the conflicts that occurred, especially in the 1970s, really shaped and reshaped the entire third world. उसका नक्शा भी तब्दील हुआ, उसकी सियासत भी तब्दील हुई, उसकी सकाफत भी तब्दील हुई, उसकी मईशत भी तब्दील हुई. इस वजह से we think that the Cold War is very, very important to understanding how the third world has really been shaped in the 20th century. Moreover, leaders of third world movements or leaders in the third world themselves have often shaped their political agenda in terms of what they've seen with respect to the global order. Now, the United States of America has a very interesting, peculiar history. And one of the features of the United States of America is that it was itself created in a revolution. And as a consequence, it always imagined itself, the US elites always imagined themselves to be leading a new kind of state based on liberty, based on secularism, based on Enlightenment principles. And moreover, because the United States of America was so far removed from Europe and the theater of conflicts in Europe, they also imagined themselves to be exclusive, separate from, and to some extent, even though they were intervening in many parts of the world, they always imagined themselves as being somewhat isolationist. Aajkal, you hear about Donald Trump saying, why are we doing this in Ukraine, and why are we doing that in Iraq, and why are we doing this in Afghanistan? He's a conservative. He's from the right of the political spectrum of the United States of America. And you may also see on Fox News people like other commentators often saying, why should we care what happens in the rest of the world? Many commentators say that in the US. This comes from a long line of thinking within the United States of America. Ki khasma nu khaye the rest of the world, we are happy. Why should we go jumping across the seas? In fact, not just the seas, the oceans, the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. Why should we bother with all of that? We are perfectly happy in our home, and this is where we should remain. This idea has a long history itself. So US engagement outside of its borders has always had to contend with this central idea that the United States is somewhat isolationist. Even though when you actually look at their actions, that's not necessarily the case. During the Spanish-American War in 1898, Philippines became one of the US colonies. And you can see that William Jennings Bryan, who was the nominee of the Democratic Party for president 3 times, 1896, in 1900 and 1908. He was a superb speaker. In fact, it may interest you to know that he was also very much part of the Scopes trial. The Scopes trial was a very famous trial about Darwinism. And William Jennings Bryan was the person who was arguing against Darwinism. He was saying this is not correct. Anyway, his view is very much informed by that idea of the United States being exclusive and on its own. He says, our whole history has been an encouragement not only to the Filipinos but to all who are denied a voice in their own government. While our sphere of activity has been limited to the Western Hemisphere, our sympathies have not been bounded by the seas. We have felt it due to ourselves and to the world, as well as those who were struggling for the right to govern themselves, to proclaim the interest which our people have from the date of their own independence, felt in every contest between human rights and arbitrary power. In other words, the United States of America did not see itself as a colonial power, but rather its opposite. They saw themselves as a country that has been made in a revolution against colonialism. What was the colonial power in the United States of America? Well, of course, it was, the biggest one was Great Britain, but there was also, of course, France, and thirdly, there were the Spanish and the Portuguese. The Spanish and the Portuguese controlled Southern America. तो फ्रांस भी था, ब्रिटेन भी था, स्पेन भी था, पोर्चुगल भी था, ब्राज़ील जो है वो ब्राज़ीलियंस पोर्चुगीज़ में बात करते हैं, अर्जेंटीनियंस, चिलियंस वगैरह ये सब स्पेनिश में बात करते हैं. ऊपर चले जाएं कनाडा के अंदर तो वहाँ पे आज भी लोग एक province में French भी बोलते हैं. So these were colonies of the British and French. They were directly under the crown as such. They were directly under the British crown, and they rebelled against it. And this is called the American Revolution. और ये wars हुई from 1776 to 1783. And this is the first country, by the way, might interest you to know. This is the first country that's been founded on the basis of what we call Enlightenment principles. What are those principles? कोई बादशाहत नहीं होगी. We do not accept a monarchy, and we do not also accept an aristocracy. कोई feudal class नहीं होगी. अमेरिका में कभी feudal class ना थी, ना आई कभी. It's the only country, European country, which started free of feudalism, except for the British, who were, of course, had a monarchy. And in this early period, the Americans were basically a colony of the British. Secondly, no established church. जब उन्होंने अपने आप को आज़ाद किया, अपना इनकलाब किया, तो उन्होंने कहा कि हमारी जो पार्लियामेंट है, हमारी जो कांग्रेस है, वो कोई रिलीजन नहीं इस्टेब्लिश करेगी. स्टेट का कोई मजहब भी नहीं होगा. It's the first country to declare something like that. Although हमारे जहन में बात ये अक्सर आती है कि it's the French Revolution that first declared it, but the French Revolution comes after the American Revolution. तीसरी बात, अगर ये चर्च भी नहीं होगी, रिलीजन भी गाइड नहीं करेगा स्टेट को, तो क्या चीज़ गाइड करेगी? उन्होंने कहा नेचुरल राइट्स. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and they're endowed with natural rights. Yani by nature you have certain rights. Just because you're a human being, you have certain rights. Sadly, of course, they didn't consider that that would apply to the African Americans who were in the slave plantations. Furthermore, they said we'll have a social contract. We'll have a contract with people. Social contract theory, of course, is much older. We can go to Locke, we can go to Hobbes, we can go even earlier, all the way to the Greeks, etc. But they are also one of the first states to put this into practice. And most importantly, we believe in individual freedom. Not just freedom of the United States of America, we believe in that too, but we also believe that everybody in the United States of America must be free, free of the church, free of aristocracy, free to do whatever they want, practice whatever religion they want, and so on and so forth. But there was also a deep, dark side to the United States of America. There was, of course, the presence of African slavery, especially in what we call the South. And there was the genocide of the Native American population, from whom the United States of America had been taken away. Let's first look at their own concepts of liberty. For Thomas Jefferson and many others of the founding fathers of the United States of America, the concept, the very concept of liberty was tied to property. You can only have liberty, they thought, if you have property, if you have malkiyat. By his property or by his satisfactory situation is interested in the support of law and order, and such men may safely and advantageously reserve to themselves a wholesome control over their public affairs and a degree of freedom which in the hands of the canal of the cities of Europe would be instantly perverted to the demolition and destruction of everything public and private. But even in Europe, a change has sensibly taken place in the mind of man. Science has liberated the ideas of those who read and reflect. And the American example has kindled feelings of right in the people. An insurrection has consequently begun. It has failed in its first effort. He's referring to the French Revolution. Because the mobs of the cities, the instrument used for its accomplishment, debased by ignorance, poverty, and vice, could not be restrained to rational action. But the world will recover from the panic of this first catastrophe. In other words, the Americans are already viewing the concept of American liberty as being something teleological, that the world is going to go in this direction. It is destined to go in that direction. When they looked at Latin America, they had the same feelings about it, that they are mired in superstition, but eventually they will emerge. They will be liberated from foreign subjection, I have little doubt, but the result of my inquiries does not authorize me to hope they are capable of maintaining a free government. Their people are immersed in the darkest ignorance and brutalized by bigotry and superstition. They need to embrace science and enlightenment. But light will at length beam in on their minds, and the standing example we shall hold up, serving as an excitement as well as a model for their direction, may in the long run qualify them for self-government. In the long run, they will also achieve self-government, that is, the people of South America. So the United States of America had this concept of individual liberty. And I have this cowboy up over here because he really embodied that idea of individual liberty. वो कभी आपने सिगरेट के कमर्शियल्स देखे? मार्लबोरो मैन जब 80s में हम बड़े हो रहे थे तो वो बड़ा पॉपुलर हुआ करता था. वो काउबॉय था और वो बड़ा रफ एंड टफ माचो मैन टाइप था. अब तो आप उसको कहेंगे सर दिस इज सो टॉक्सिक मैस्कुलिनिटी वगैरह, मगर उस ज़माने में हमें टॉक्सिक मैस्कुलिनिटी बेतहाशा पसंद थी, लड़कों को, लड़कियों को नहीं. तो वो आता है और वो सिगरेट पीता है और हम सारे इतने उससे इम्प्रेस थे कि हम सारों ने भी मार्लबोरो सिगरेट पीने शुरू कर दिए. Within a little bit of time I realized that this is terrible for your health. I stopped. Magar, Marlboro man did not stop. And sadly he died of cancer because he smoked too many cigarettes. Anyway, the idea of this rough and tough cowboy who owns land, he has his horses, he has his own farm, became kind of central to the whole idea of what US liberty meant. He had his own property. It was his private property. He was anti-collectivist in the sense that he has his individual farm and he was the king of his farm. He's not interested in what the government does there, whether it comes in or goes out, etc. In fact, he does not want the government in at all. It was anti-centralized with respect to political power. The 13 colonies that became independent wanted to maintain their independence. They did not want a centralized government. So they made sure that the government was very, very decentralized. In fact, that's where you get the American electoral system from. That each candidate has to win in each of the states and then the votes of the states are counted. You know that, right? And of course, they embraced scientific principles of enlightenment and finally the capitalist market economy. That was American freedom. They felt that, in fact, the collectivist strain had given rise to monarchies and repressive kind of governments and authoritarian kind of religions and so on, and we were a free people. That was their ideology, that was their thought, and still is. You can see it in all their movies even. In American movies, it's always the lone individual who saves the world. It's not people working in big collectives and big numbers who come and save the world. In fact, every American hero is always the person who does not obey orders. He can never obey orders. I don't know why. He can never go with the flow. He can never go, he's like, I don't want to go with the sheep. I'm going to be different. Right? Being different is a kind of, how should I put it, a kind of a national ideology with respect to the United States of America. The idea in the United States of America also developed now that they had a manifest destiny. It was inevitable. It was manifest. It was going to happen. You see this black line over here? This is the area of the original 13 colonies that became independent and came to call themselves the United States of America. Then suddenly you can see they expanded and took over this whole gray area. And then they started expanding further and took over all these areas. They basically took over Louisiana, Florida, Texas, the Northwest. These were all acquired by conquest or by the threat of conquest from Mexico in 1848. ये सारा जो है, Texas annexed by US in 1845, ceded by Mexico in 1848. All of this was with the Mexicans. Louisiana was from France. They pretty much bought it. Yes, they purchased it. They said, sell it to us. The French said, okay, fine, and so on. They also bought Alaska from the Russians, which of course you can't see on this map because it's up north. Huge area. In 1809, it was 800,000 square miles. And by 1867, it was now 3.5 million square miles. So dramatic expansion just in the first half of the 19th century. Of course, this expansion came at the expense of the indigenous tribes of the United States of America. The Native Americans in particular were driven off their lands. The estimates tell us that in 1492, the population of the United States of America was approximately 8 million Native Americans, what we call Red Indians, 8 million. And sadly, by 1776, when the United States of America was established, that population had halved to only 4 million. And furthermore, by 1890, this whole century of manifest destiny, it had declined to only 250,000. from 8 million to 2.5 lakh. Massive depletion of the population. Most of them died because they were moved off from valuable land, from their tribal land with which they were connected. Many also died because of diseases that their bodies were not used to, that were brought in from the European continent. And of course, many were slaughtered and killed and massacred. Similarly, the American continent as a whole imported about 12.5, nearly 13 million black people as slaves. Most of this flow went to South America, but some of it also came to the United States of America. About 400,000 came here. And most of them were focused at that time in what we call the South, where cotton was grown because it's very hot there, and you can grow cotton in a hot climate. And they were the ones who would pick the cotton, they were the ones who would plant the cotton, they were the cotton farmers of the United States of America. This was the labor. They couldn't use the labor of the Native Americans who were not familiar with agriculture. They were a tribal people. They just threw them off the land. They didn't have enough labor on their own, so they got labor from the nearest continent, which was Africa. And they also, therefore, had to control immigration. They wanted to make sure that the people who come in would be the right kind of people. On the one hand, we are getting all the African Americans to come and do the labor, but on the other hand, you've heard this phrase that the United States of America is a melting pot. Many people from Ireland were coming over because of the Irish famine. Many people from Germany were coming over. Many people from France, from Britain were coming over in big numbers, big numbers. Even from Poland and Russia, etc., people were coming over. Most of the people who were coming over were not part of the landed class. They were oftentimes people who really had no place to go. Like, अभी आपने सुना होगा कि कुछ पाकिस्तानी एक अजीबो-गरीब सी इन्फ्लेटेबल किस्म की कश्ती में कोशिश कर रहे थे कि वो यूरोप पहुंच जाए किसी तरह, वो कश्ती डूब गई. इसी किस्म का कुछ मामला इन लोगों के साथ भी था. ये भी सारे गरीब लोग थे जो बड़ी मुश्किल से इधर पहुंचे कि वहाँ पे हम एक नई ज़िंदगी शुरू करेंगे. क्यों? वहाँ पे क्यों नई ज़िंदगी शुरू होगी? यूरोप में क्यों नहीं हो सकती? क्योंकि वहाँ पे ज़मीन बहुत है. अगर हम वहाँ पहुँच गए और फिर वहाँ से हम आगे वेस्ट की तरफ निकल गए तो वेस्ट में हमें ज़मीन मिल जाएगी जो हम आबाद कर लेंगे. So it was a colonial project. So now they had to make sure that you get the right kind of people. From 1870 to 1920, the United States of America received 26 million immigrants. But they had to create organizations such as the Immigration Restriction League to make sure कि racial purity maintain होनी चाहिए. वो वाले बंदे आए जो हमें पसंद हैं, हमारे जैसे यूरोपियंस आए तो ठीक है, दूसरे लोग ना आए. So President John Quincy Adams writes in 1821, wherever the standard of freedom and independence has been or shall be unfurled, there will her heart, her benediction and her prayers be. किसकी बात कर रहा है? United States, अपनी country की. But she goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. दूसरी दुनिया के अंदर monsters हैं मगर हम नहीं वहाँ जाएंगे उनको तोड़ने तोड़ने. She is the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all. She is the champion and vindictor only of her own. हम अपने champions हैं. हम दूसरों को कहते हैं कि यार बेस्ट ऑफ लक एक्सेट्रा, मगर हम अपनी जगह पे खुश हैं जो हम कर रहे हैं, ठीक है. अब इन द यूनाइटेड स्टेट्स ऑफ अमेरिका स्लेवरी बहुत बड़े पैमाने पे प्रैक्टिस होती थी. नॉर्थ में नहीं, साउथ में. नॉर्थ और साउथ की हो गई लड़ाई. साउथ वाले जो है वो सेसीड करना चाहते थे, वो नहीं चाहते थे कि स्लेवरी जो है वो अबॉलिश की जाए. नॉर्थ में ये बंदा इक़्तिदार में आया. ही वाज फ्रॉम अ वर्किंग क्लास फैमिली एंड अ सुपर्ब राइटर, सुपर्ब इंटेलेक्चुअल, और इसने मोबिलाइज किया आर्मी को और कंट्री को. ही वन बाय वेरी थिन मेजॉरिटी. इन फैक्ट इट वाज अ स्प्लिट वर्डिक्ट. तुक्के से इब्राहिम लिंकन वन. हिस्ट्री वुड हैव बीन वेरी डिफरेंट had he not won that election. But once he won that election, he made sure कि slavery मैंने ख़त्म करनी ही करनी. This is the biggest war in the history of the United States of America. Bigger than Vietnam or any other war. This is a civil war. और लाखों लोग इसमें मारे गए. लाखों लोग. Can't imagine how bloody it was. Much more bloody than 1776. No comparison even. But finally, Lincoln did win. And after winning, the whole system of slavery was dismantled. It took time, of course, many compromises. After that, the United States of America now suddenly just began to grow rapidly. It industrialized in a very quick manner. and it acquired, therefore, also a new confidence. But this new confidence, sadly, also had very racist kind of overtones. Especially after the victory of the United States in the Spanish-American War in 1898, Rudyard Kipling wrote a famous poem called The White Man's Burden, in which he says to the United States of America that now the white man's burden has fallen on you because you have become one of the strongest Western powers. Kehta hai, this is of course Rudyard Kipling over here. Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' needs. To wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk in wild, your new caught sullen peoples, half devil, half child. Take up the white man's burden in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror and check the show of pride. By open speech and simple, by 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace. Fill full the mouth of famine and bid the sickness cease. And when your goal is nearest, the end for others sought, watch sloth and heathen folly bring all your hopes to naught. Take up the white man's burden, no tawdry rule of kings, but soil of serf and sweeper, the tale of common things. The ports ye shall not enter, the roads ye shall not tread. Go make them with your living and mark them with your dead. Take up the white man's burden and reap his old reward. The blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard. The cry of hosts ye humor are slowly towards the light. Why brought he us from bondage, our loved Egyptian night? Take up the white man's burden, ye dare not stoop to less, nor call too loud on freedom to cloak your weariness. By all ye cry or whisper, by all ye leave or do, the silent, sullen peoples shall weigh your gods and you. Take up the white man's burden, have done with childish days, the lightly proffered laurel, the easy ungrudged praise. Comes now to search your manhood through all the thankless years, cold-edged with dear-bought wisdom, the judgment of your peers. In other words, this is the white man's burden, कि दुनिया को आपने ठीक करना है, औरतों को ठीक कर नहीं सकता, और white लोग ही, और वो भी white men ही ठीक कर सकते हैं. So now the United States of America is thinking of itself, especially after World War I, as the one true power, the ring to unite all rings, the ring of power, right? It's the major capitalist Western power now in the world. Especially after what happens in World War I in Europe, nobody can any longer compete with the economic strength and political strength of the United States of America. At this time, the US has a president who was a political science professor, meaning there's hope for me yet. His name was Woodrow Wilson, and he wrote his famous 14 points. You thought it was Qaid-e-Azam. Unke alada 14 points the. This is Woodrow Wilson, very important person. After World War I, Europe had devastated itself. You cannot imagine what that war was like. It was a trench war. There's a Netflix serial called All Quiet on the Western Front. Now, Europe had debased itself, the Americans felt, in an orgy of blood and hatred. It's horrific. And it was up to the Americans to set things right. So that's what the 14 points were all about. The President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, felt that the reason why Europe had gone to war had to do with nationalism. As new nations developed and emerged within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, within the Ottoman Empire, they awoke to national life. They wanted independence. Since that independence was crushed, it triggered World War I. So he felt that he had to solve the national question. He had to solve this question in such a way that the national aspirations of people were fulfilled. So he began talking about the right of nations to self-determination. He felt this is the best means to avoid war, which leads to revolution. Which revolution is he talking about? The Bolshevik Revolution, the revolution in Russia. and it leads to death and destruction and the end of capitalism, and he has to save Western civilization, capitalism, and so on. This is the way to do it. It was this meeting of the League of Nations and the 14 points of Woodrow Wilson that also inspired people in India to say that we are also a nation and we deserve the right of self-determination. India should be independent. So now they met at this conference and they said, okay, let's break up these big states and give each of these people a nation state. The Ottoman Empire was broken. From it, they created Iraq. They created Palestine, which later, as you know, was divided into Israel and Palestine. They created Syria. From the German colonies, they created Tanzania, Southwest Africa, Cameroon, etc., 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 many other small countries. And from Europe, they created Austria, they created Hungary, they created Czechoslovakia, they created Yugoslavia. They created Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. So they created many new states. And now the United States thought and felt that the same solution had to be applied also to the colonial world, to the huge British Empire, to the French Empire. These big, huge colonial states had denied many, many people the right of self-determination, and this would inevitably lead to war and revolution, and this would create hotbeds of chaos and anarchy. In order to stem that tide, decolonization had to take place. US was not interested in maintaining those colonial empires. Part of the reason was also self-serving. Part of the reason was that Britain or France का empire जब टूटेगा, तो United States of America का influence भी बढ़ेगा. But part of the reason also was Europe had completely destroyed itself in World War II. 50 million people dead. It was even worse than World War I. It was horrific. And that war, the World War I and then World War II, had given rise to Soviet communism, to Bolshevism. This was seen by the United States of America as a deadly rival to the American way of life because it put forward an alternative form of modernity. They weren't saying we're going to go back to some feudal period or something, an alternative modernity. A way poor and downtrodden people could challenge their conditions without replicating the American or even the European model. They had to defeat it. One of the ways in which one of the effects of this was the rise also of McCarthyism. You see McCarthy over here. US elites wanted an American revolution. They wanted it in their own country, they wanted it in Europe, and they wanted it in the third world. The American way of life had to be protected and it had to be exported. That meant, of course, that the immigrants also had to be carefully selected and you had to make sure that they subscribe to Americanism. So when the Communist Party of the United States of America was created, McCarthy said, oh, we have to stamp them out. Now, what did he say about them? He created what was called the House of Un-American Activities Committee. So in other words, he was accusing the communists of being basically un-American. In what sense were they un-American? He felt that they did not believe in individual freedom in the American way of life. You can see how that idea of the American way of life is rooted in their revolution and history, and how they perceive communism as being completely contrary to that. And they also felt in World War II that the monsters had returned. The monsters, they were saying, okay, there are monsters, but we are not going to interfere. But now, after World War II, they felt they had returned. They were now convinced that, look, the US has to intervene in the world, in Europe. Why? If we don't, the world will destroy itself. It will go Bolshevik, there will be war, there will be anarchy, there will be chaos. We can give the world what they really need. And what they really need are the kind of individual freedoms, the American way of life. China became one of the first test cases for them, where they supported the government of Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek lost to the communists, Mao Zedong, etc., moved to Taiwan, and which is why you continue to see the Taiwanese and Chinese rivalry even till today. Later, Korea and Vietnam also became battlegrounds for the United States of America. US, of course, fought in Korea, big war from 51 to 53, and they directly fought the communists of China as well, because China also sent people into Korea to fight. And then, of course, they also fought the communists in Vietnam. And the United States of America often used to say, especially when the Cuban Revolution occurred under the leadership of Fidel Castro, you can see over here, these people are so ungrateful. They just don't understand what we can give them. We can give them a better life. They just don't understand. For example, the State Department folks write, if the United States was received but with little gratitude, this is only to be expected in a world where gratitude is rarely accorded to the teacher, the doctor, or the policeman, and we have been all three. We are the teachers, the doctors, the policemen of the world. Nobody likes us, but we do what is necessary for the world. But it may be that in time they will come to see the United States with different eyes, and to have for her something of the respect and affection with which a man regards the instructor of his youth and a child looks upon the parent who has molded his character. हाय मेरे दिल की बात करती, मैं भी एक चाहता हूँ कि जब आप बड़े होंगे तो आप सोचेंगे हाँ हमने भी कोर्स लिया था तैमूर रहमान से, उस वक्त हमें बड़े पैड़ा लगता था, बट यू नो इतना भी पैड़ा नहीं सी, शायद आप भी ये सोचें ना. आई एम फीलिंग अ बिट लाइक द यूनाइटेड स्टेट्स ऑफ अमेरिका माई सेल्फ. The main goal, though, was very clear after World War II. They had to combat communism. It had to be defeated in Europe, in Asia, everywhere else. For Europe, they therefore devised the Marshall Plan. It's a very important plan in which they said, we are going to give you the money to rebuild your countries, all of them. We're going to give you huge amounts of money. We'll give you technology, we'll give you money, rebuild it. Why? Why would they do that? Because they were afraid that if they didn't, the Soviet Union would sweep up, or a communist revolution would sweep up, and the whole of Europe would go communist. This was not an empty idea. This was, I think, exaggerated a little bit. But it was true that communism at that time was very popular in Europe, all across Europe. In Italy, you had this fellow, Antonio Gramsci, who pretty much died in prison against the fascists, hugely popular. In Spain, you had the Republic and the legacy of that fighting against fascism. In France, you had the party of 70,000 martyrs, which is the French Communist Party, which had about a third of the assembly seats of France after the war, and was an armed party. They had guns because they were fighting against the Nazis. All of them were armed parties. In Greece, it was armed, etc., etc. So the second thing they had to create was a security pact. This was the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. Now it's an even bigger pact than it was when it started out. It is one of the strongest, biggest pacts in the history of military pacts today. It is so strong, it's so big, it's so huge, it's so absolutely enormous that, there is really, in terms of military strength, no other alliance that can even come close to it. It's that big. We have learned in Europe, the Americans felt, what to do in Asia. For under the Marshall Plan, we have developed the essential instruments of a successful policy in the arena of world politics, said Paul Hoffman, who is an administrator for the Marshall Plan. Marshall Plan was hugely successful. He said, we do the same thing now for India, Pakistan, other countries, etc. Japan and Korea, of course, were occupied by United States of America. The United States of America now also toppled moderate left-wing governments, including the government of Mohammad Mossadegh, who you see over here, who was the Prime Minister of Iran. Why was he toppled in Operation Ajax? Because he wanted to nationalize the oil company. And of course, the United States of America also began to support anti-communist government, states, etc., against the Vietnamese guerrillas, the Malay guerrillas, as well as guerrillas in the Philippines. I've been to two of these countries, Vietnam and Malaysia now, and quite interesting to see that history. Now, US aid also began to flow, especially to the military. Ayub Khan was an early recipient of this, although we started getting aid even earlier than that. And 95% of all aid in 54 and more than 50% in 1960 was basically military aid. You had to fight the communists. So you had to arm and equip those militaries. The intention was to prevent left-wing governments from coming to power and also to shore up local elites. And often the United States of America chose military rulers. That was the preference. Democracy was so messy. They said, "Ye nahi theek hai." Who knows, people might just elect the communists, etc. So no. Let's just go with military dictatorship. That's the best way we can crush communists. Baad mein democracy kar lenge, once we have crushed the communists. So the world had to be made safe for capitalism. For example, Woodrow Wilson, when he was still a professor and had not become president, and therefore was more honest, जब मैं भी प्रेसिडेंट हो जाऊंगा, बस होने जा रहा हूँ, फिक्र ना करें, just a joke. I might not stay as honest. वो कहते हैं ना, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But when he was a professor, he wrote, since the manufacturer insists on having the world as a market, the flag of his nation must follow him, and the doors of nations which are closed against him must be battered down. Concessions obtained by financiers must be safeguarded by ministers of state, even if the sovereignty of unwilling nations be outraged in the process. Why do states go and batter down these walls, destroy other states? It's for business, he's saying. It's all business, the business of war. Aid also began to flow now. Here is Secretary of State John Foster Dulles in 1954. He says, I have become personally convinced that it is going to be very difficult to stop communism in much of the world if we cannot in some way duplicate the intensive communist effort to raise productive standards. Communists are trying to raise productive standards in third world countries. They are building big dams like the Aswan Dam in Egypt. They're building infrastructure. They're doing all these kinds of other things. If we don't do something similar, we're not going to be able to stop them. Okay? So mainly it was the United States of America, although they were saying it for the whole of the Western world, but it was mainly the US which was giving massive amounts of aid. From 56 to 60, only slightly less than 90% of all official aid to the third world came from the advanced capitalist countries, what we would call OECD countries today. But of that percentage, 60 to 70% came basically from the US. So Britain, France, etc., they were not giving a lot of aid. It was mainly the US. And that has mainly been the pattern since the Second World War. And the US felt if we can give people modernization, modern education, technology, we can bring American globalism, we can do globalization, and then people can enjoy all these things. Look, there's Pepsi, and there's Subway, and there's Pizza Hut, and there's all sorts of other, McDonald's is there. You can enjoy all these amazing things, right? That's the American way of life. Go work hard, make lots of money, and then have lots of burgers, and then run on a treadmill to work off all the cholesterol, etc. It was a freedom offered by washing machines, dishwashers, vacuum cleaners, automobiles, refrigerators, and now, of course, mobile phones, all of these things. Education was also very important in this entire process. They developed a whole theory to counter what they thought was the Marxist paradigm. And the two main people who developed it is Walt W. Rostow, and Talcott Parsons. So they developed what we refer to as modernization theory. How do we take a country like Pakistan and how do we modernize it? That's what we want. So Walt Rostow writes, the danger is that increasing numbers of people will become convinced that their new aspirations can be realized only through violent change and the renunciation of democratic institutions. The danger is greatly increased by the existence of communism, not because of any authentic attraction in its ideology, but because the communists have recognized their opportunities to exploit the revolution of rising expectations by picturing communism as the road to social opportunity or economic improvement or individual dignity and achievement of national self-respect. The communists are getting into the people's minds and trying to convince them that if you become communist, things will be great. And they're pushing them to violent revolution. We have to stop that. How do we stop that? Through education, through development. So this is what created what we call developmentalism. Development studies, development economics, the whole paradigm. And they said Henry Kissinger, he writes, starting from a position of substantial inferiority in almost all areas, Soviet Union हमसे बहुत पीछे था. The Soviet Union has caught up with and surpassed us in more categories than are comforting. बड़ा मसला बना हुआ है, आगे निकल गए हमसे. So we have to do something. We have to develop the third world in some way. One of the things, of course, they did is this. The Lahore University of Management Sciences gratefully acknowledges the generous donation of US $10 million made by the United States Agency for International Development, that's USAID, for the construction of this academic block and ancillary facilities April 14th, 1994. This is the American way of life. The lums. उन्हें अब जारा की पता सी कि तैमूर रहमान पटक पड़ेगा थे बच्चियां नु खराब करेगा मगर बहरहाल आगे देखते हैं. Interestingly, people who were studying in the United States of America and influenced by what we call Americanism were also influenced by the radical side of American politics and society itself. They were influenced by the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, the feminist movement, and people like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and people like Malcolm X and many other intellectuals found within the United States of America who were critical of what the US was doing all over the world. So in fact, it was often the people who were studying the American way of life who also became infected, myself included. I went to the US to study. I did my undergraduate in the US, by these radical ideas, themselves the product of the contradictions of life in the United States.